All right, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So, before we will get in, let's do a quick announcements. So, for now, we will be most likely holding services online because we're still working out all the details with the buildings that we are potentially looking at, possibly renting from. Nothing concrete yet. We have a few negotiations going, but for now, it'll be kind of like the COVID times. We'll just be meeting online. But what else is there? So, Pastor, pretty much everyone's gone. Um, Pastor, Pastor's wife, Alan, Tiana, Mark, Jasmine, they're all gone. They're on vacation right now. At some conference. So it is just me today. So there will be no Russian translation. It's just going to be a full-on English service. So without further ado, we can hop right into the Torah portion. So before we begin, as always, let's just ask for God's blessing over this word so that everything that I say, everything that comes out is in accordance with His will and touches the hearts of the people listening. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Abba, I thank you for this day, for this beautiful set apart day that you have established since the beginning of creation, for us to come before you, worship you in spirit and in truth, and in unity and in fellowship, even though we are technically long distance right now. Thank you that you allow us to live to this moment so that we can have another chance at learning new things, implementing new things, and growing our light to be pure vessels for your will, to bless others and to be blessed ourselves. I ask you for your hand in this service so that everything that comes out of my mouth will be in accordance with your will, and so that you will also bless the ears, the minds, the hearts of the people listening so that they will hear your word, they will understand your word, they will accept your word, and they will implement your word into their lives for their own betterment, for correction, and to be walking blessings. In the name of Yeshua. Amen. So this Torah portion, it is called Bo, which is translated as either go or come, depending on context, I guess. But for the most part, the context here would be come to Pharaoh's house. And this is the 13th weekly Torah portion that is found in Exodus chapter 10 through 16. So I'll do a quick summary and then I'll start off with the opening reading. So Bo is the 13th weekly Torah portion in the book of Exodus, and it covers the final 3 of the 10 plagues and the institution of the Passover holiday, known as Pesach in Hebrew. The portion begins with God commanding Moses to warn Pharaoh about the oncoming locusts, which will destroy Egypt's crops. Then comes a plague of darkness that lasts for 3 days, and finally, the last and most devastating plague, the death of Egypt's firstborns. Strikes affecting every Egyptian household. God commands the Israelites to mark their doorposts with lamb's blood so that the angel of death will pass over their homes and spare them. The Israelites are also instructed to eat a roasted lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs as part of the Passover meal, and to be ready to leave Egypt quickly. The Israelites prepare for the Exodus, and Pharaoh finally relents, allowing them to leave. God establishes the holiday of Passover as an eternal commemoration of the Exodus, with specific rituals to observe annually. And the parsha ends with the consecration of the firstborn to God, a symbolic reminder of their redemption from Egypt. And so, the opening verse, which we'll start from the very beginning and slowly work our way down, chapter 10, and touch upon some things in the other chapters. But the opening reading is in Exodus 10, verses 1 and 2. And Yehovah said to Moses, Go to Pharaoh, for I have made his heart heavy and the heart of his servants in order to put these signs of mine in his midst, so that you will tell in the ears of your child and your grandchild that I dealt harshly with the Egyptians, and so that you will tell about my signs that I have done among them. And so you will know that I am Yehovah. So, jumping right into it, let's start at the beginning. It says that God made Pharaoh's heart heavy. In some translations, it says hard-hearted, or he hardened his heart. Now, it's important to understand that God is not actually making Pharaoh's heart hard so that he continues to defy God and not let the people go. What is actually happening is that Pharaoh is a man of great responsibility and also of great ego. When first approached and told to let the people go, immediately Pharaoh must have been thinking, if I let 600,000 slaves go, who will pick up the slack? We have goals and deadlines. That's preposterous. Also, if he lets 600,000 slaves leave, what will the other nations around me think? For starters, it will weaken Egypt's economic stance. It will weaken their military position from a defensive standpoint. Although they are slaves and not soldiers, when push comes to shove, the invading forces will not care who they are and will either try to take them as their own slaves or kill them. Given how military operations generally went in that time period and general area, the men of fighting age would have been killed and the women and children taken. So the slaves will have to fight indirectly on behalf of Egypt. It will have been a huge blow to his ego, and he will not be respected or taken as seriously by the other kings of the other nations. And lastly, it would be a shame to his legacy and that of his ancestors. So there was no way that someone of his status, ego, and level of responsibility could just let 2 million people, 600,000 of which were of fighting age men, to just walk away. Then, as each calamity strikes, it takes a huge chunk of Egyptian wealth and status with it, setting them back quite a bit. So naturally, that makes the pharaoh more anxious, more nervous, more scared, etc., and therefore even more reluctant to adhere to Moses' request. This idea is supported by Exodus 10, verse 7, when the servants of Pharaoh said to him, until when will this be a snare for us? Release the men so that they may serve Jehovah their God. Do you not yet know that Egypt is destroyed? So we see this battle that Pharaoh is fighting within himself. He cares about Egypt, so he should let them go, but at the same time, it gets harder and harder to justify letting them leave as Egypt keeps getting hit harder and harder. Although seemingly trying to negotiate a way to allow the people to go, he always tried to hold something back as collateral to ensure that they return. Exodus 10, verse 10, and he said to them, let Jehovah be thus with you as soon as I release you and your dependents. So initially, he's letting them go. But then his ego kicks in, and he finishes verse 10 with, see that evil is before your faces. Kind of like trying to curse them or whatever, or gaslight them into not wanting to go. His ego didn't allow him to not have the last word. Then, as the responsible party over Egypt, he changes his mind and ensures that he has something as collateral. So initially he said, take your dependents, your children, but now, as verse 11 says, no, indeed, just the men go and serve Jehovah, since this is what you are seeking. And he drove them away from the presence of Pharaoh. So, knowing men, as he himself was a man, he knew that the most precious thing to men is their families, their wives and their children. So to ensure that they don't just run off and leave him humiliated in the face of the rest of the world and without a substantial part of his workforce, he tries to hold on to the women and children as collateral. Now, following this, the plague of locusts begins. It's written that they covered the surface of all the land, and the land was dark with them. And they ate all the vegetation of the land, and all the fruits of the trees that the hail had left, and no green was left in the trees, nor in the vegetation of the field, in all the land of Egypt. So the locusts which devour the crops of Egypt, symbolize the forces that consume the material and superficial aspects of our lives. In the spiritual sense, locusts represent our attachment to the worldly things that divert us from our purpose and our connection to God. And this is an example of how our egos are often self-destructive. Oftentimes, too often, we don't defend ourselves. We don't make the necessary correction in our lives to truly live freely with and within ourselves. Rather than defending ourselves and doing what we know is right, we operate from our egos and instead defend our excuses. Our egos will not allow us to find fault in ourselves for the situations that we put ourselves into. Rather, they puff up like leavened dough and make up every excuse under the sun to validate our current position. Oh, I'm unlucky. It's just bad genetics, or I don't have time, but I need to do this, and so on and so forth. By doing this, we are unleashing the locusts into our own lives and allowing them to wreak havoc. So I'll tell you a very short, interesting story that is very relevant to this situation. Long ago, a snake found himself slithering into an area where some carpentry work was being done. Looking around as he moved, the snake suddenly found himself in pain. He'd unwittingly moved over a handsaw, and in his perception, it had bitten him. Angry at being attacked, the snake swiftly swung back and bit his assailant. Of course, this created even greater pain, and the snake's first and only thought was revenge. Determined to come out on top, the snake coiled himself around the blade and began to constrict. The more waves of pain came, the more the snake dug in, squeezing harder and tighter. Nobody was going to treat him so poorly and get away with it, the snake thought. Of course, the snake's fate was sealed from the start. You might say he came in peace, but ended up in pieces. And so that is the story of our ego. That is the story of Pharaoh. Because he didn't want to look himself in the eye and rather defended his excuses, he unleashed the locusts into his life. But it didn't end there. Following the plague of locusts, verse 16 through 20, Pharaoh hurried to call Moses and Aaron, and he said, I have sinned against Yehovah your God and against you. And now forgive my sin surely this time, and pray to Yehovah your God, so that he may only remove me from this death. And he went out from Pharaoh, and he prayed to Yehovah, and Yehovah turned a very strong west wind and lifted up the locusts and thrust them into the Red Sea, and not one locust remained in all the territory of Egypt. And Yehovah hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he did not release the Israelites. So we see Pharaoh finally looked in the mirror and realized that his situation is his doing. He seemingly repents, and the current problem goes away. But very often, when things get good, we forget about God. Statistically, church attendance is at its peak when bad things happen. Every great tragedy that happens around the world is immediately followed up with people running to God, whether it's to churches, synagogues, temples, mosques, whatever. But when things ease up and people finally get comfortable again, they forget about God. As we always say, familiarity breeds contempt, and contempt fuels the ego. So thus, Pharaoh finally got comfortable again, and his heart was hardened. And in the Hebrew, the word for hardened is hazek, which means to be strengthened. So in Pharaoh's case, it was a re-strengthening of his ego. When our egos get so puffed up, we cannot see beyond them. So as Pharaoh's ego was re-strengthened, Yehovah said to Moses, stretch out your hands toward the heavens so that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, and so that a person can feel darkness. And Moses stretched out his hands towards the heavens, and there was darkness of night in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. No one could see his brother, and because of it, no one can move from where they were for 3 days. But there was light for the Israelites in their dwellings. When becoming so detached from the objective reality of God and balance and spirituality, focusing solely on our material self through the lens of our ego, we become absolutely blinded. We literally walk around in darkness, and because we can't see, we don't know where to go or what to do, oftentimes to the effect of not being able to do anything at all. It's kind of like when someone is going through a sleep paralysis. It's dark everywhere. You can feel the darkness all around. The darkness can manifest in all kinds of terrifying ways. And the worst part is that you're paralyzed. You can't move. You can't talk. You try to shout, but nothing comes out, and nobody can hear you. I've gone through several sleep paralyses myself. My first one was absolutely terrifying. I couldn't sleep for a good 2 weeks after that. I'd lay awake all night and just wait for the sun to come up before finally allowing myself to sleep. Luckily, I was working night shift then, but I remember to this day, I closed my eyes in that paralyzed state because I didn't want to see all of the creepy and terrifying things that were going on all around me and on top of me. And I would hear what sounded like chanting. It was very quiet at first, and it reminded me of the scene from The Lord of the Rings where Saruman, he was chanting an avalanche spell on the mountains where the fellowship was, and his voice started off quiet and subtle, and it kept growing and growing in volume the more the fellowship listened into it, to the point that it was vibrating throughout the air. And that's how the chanting that I heard started off, and it creeped me out at first, so I opened my eyes and saw all of the creepy things going on around me. And at that point, I saw a huge black entity coming up from the floor in the corner of my room. It was kind of like a black vortex. Meanwhile, I feel wind blowing over me from the direction of my window, and as I turned my head to look there, I see my curtains blowing in the breeze, and a black cat starts crawling from the window across my bed and towards my face. And at this point, the black entity in the corner finally stood up, and its head touched the ceiling, and it was holding something in his hand, kind of looked like a sword, a black sword. And I immediately closed my eyes again, and I heard what I thought was chanting, but as I listened in, I realized the voice was my dad's, and it sounded like he was praying the way he does when God's spirit is really flowing through him, and he's getting all like almost prophetic. And so I started praying too, and while my eyes were still closed, everything started getting white, and I felt an opposite wind blow over me, as if everything was suddenly sucked back out of the room through that window. And then when I opened my eyes again, and the room was completely empty, and the window was closed. And then I finally actually opened my eyes physically after the paralysis left. But in a similar manner, when we are disconnected spiritually and funnel everything in our lives through our ego, we walk around in a darkness that can be felt like in my sleep paralysis, for example. We feel fear, anxiety, dread, anger, etc. at every single turn, everywhere we look. Sometimes we wake up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat, feeling scared and don't even know why. And we are willing to give up whatever it takes to not feel that anymore, like the Egyptians giving away all of the gold and silver and jewels while they were in this state of darkness. Similar to how people that are suffering from darkness today run to the experts and mediums for relief, taking all kinds of pharmaceuticals, from the word pharmakia meaning sorceries, but to no avail. When the real remedy, the, the only way to truly heal and bask in light is, as Paul writes in Galatians 5, verse 24. Now those who belong to Christ have crucified the flesh together with its feelings and its desires. That is, setting the ego aside. Some call it the ego death. And that's one of the meanings of the final plague, the death of the firstborn. The firstborn is a representation of legacy, of manifested or materialized ideas. When our legacy and the ideas that we work on to manifest and materialize are being molded through our expression of ego, they are doomed to fail. as Matthew 23 verse 12 puts it. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. This does not mean to make yourself a floor mat, let everyone step all over you. This simply means to set your ego aside and operate within the consecrated firstborn of Yehovah state. The death of the firstborn of Egypt is symbolic of their egos being put to shame. And following these plagues, God gives the instruction to consecrate the firstborn to Him. This means that the primary focus of all of our ideas and our endeavors should be to glorify God, to show our love for God and to each other, not to snake someone else that you can gain something at their expense. There is no joy in winning a race against someone that you shot in the foot just as the race started. But by consecrating the firstborn of our thoughts and our ideas and the works of our hands, we will have so much more satisfaction in the things that we do, and a lot more peace and joy in our hearts. No longer will we be walking around with anxiety and shuddering at every phone call that comes in out of fear that it might be that angry guy that we snaked a few months ago. Rather, we will look forward to each day and moment. Let's do a thought experiment. Say there's a party that you're invited to and 50 people are attending. Typically, parties require some kind of contribution, be it drinks or snacks or activities or whatever. Now, if everyone contributed something, but you didn't, you'll feel guilty by partaking in the things that the others brought, and you will not get as much of that pleasure and satisfaction out of them. If all 50 people didn't bring anything, then it's just going to be a lame party. Now, if all 50 people come with some sort of contribution, the party will be amazing and everyone will have a great time. So there's freedom and beauty in order, especially when we do it out of our love for God and our neighbor. When we do it towards life and building up rather than death and destruction. And this is the difference between the Israelite camps in the land of Egypt when the angel of death came by during the Passover. The doorposts and lintel had to be covered in the blood of the lamb for the angel of death to pass over them. The doorposts and lintel created the letter Het, and when you paint the doorposts and lintel holding the hyssop, you get the letters Het and Yod. So He or Chai, meaning life. And interestingly enough, this is where the East Asians and the Chinese get their what they call Qi or Qi, which also means life or life force. And so the more life force you have, the more sensitive you are spiritually, and the more overall well-being you have, as opposed to people that don't have any life force in them, and they simply focus on their own egos and vanities, which end up actually depleting life force from them. So when we operate out of life and love, the angel of death passes over us. But when we are solely self-seeking, we eventually find what we are seeking, which will be at the bottom of the pit. As Yeshua said, the most important commandment is to Shema, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your being, and to love your neighbor as yourself. So, in order for us to truly do that, we must crucify the flesh, as we read in Galatians, which is a metaphor for our ego, our self-seekingness, things that puff us up, blind us, that eventually lead us to our own destruction if we don't acknowledge them and we correct them, like the snake with the saw parable. And so, in closing, I encourage everyone to look into the mirror and to reevaluate your lives and to find the correction that needs to take place and to put to death your excuses and validations. And together, work towards unity and oneness with God and with each other, working towards unity, peace, joy, and love. And so in closing, I just want to say a quick prayer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Abba, I thank you for this Torah portion, for all the wisdom that is laid out, and just how well it is structured. The formulas for how to fail and fall, and then the formula of how to ascend and shine. I ask you that you work with everyone that is listening, everyone that will listen, everyone that studies this for themselves and comes to their own understandings of the very many deep layers of wisdom, all interwoven within these stories and the metaphors and the symbolism. I ask you to strengthen everyone to continue to work towards righteousness, towards justice, towards doing what is right, even when they really don't want to, even when their ego is trying to give them every excuse under the sun to not do what is right, but to suffer in their own choices. And I ask you to bless the remainder of this set apart day of this Shabbat so that everyone will be fully edified, everyone will be fully rested, everyone will be ready to take on the upcoming week and all the challenges, all the lessons, and all of the opportunities that will be presented to them every single day throughout the next week leading up to the next Shabbat. In Yeshua's name, amen. So that is the end of our service. I wish you all a good Shabbat, full of shalom, full of peace, full of love, full of joy and unity. I encourage you to go out, since we couldn't meet today in person, to go meet with, get together with someone you care about, maybe someone you haven't seen in a while, or even your family. Go out, go do something, bond, do something that will strengthen the bond, strengthen the love, and really put a new perspective into your lives regarding what you truly want as opposed to what you think you want, and really meditate on that. And with that said, wish you all a good week. Shabbat